One of the things that jumps out when you were just talking then is I know in hospitality we've talked about personalization for a long, long time.
Yeah.
But it's never been achievable, right? But with single source identity, a hotel company can truly know my preferences if I keep them up to date and I share my key with them.
And you have the technology to do so, which is what we're talking about here. And that's a really, really important point. So, I would answer that by saying, why does the hotel want to keep any information about you at all? Right? Because any information they have is going to be out of date relative to the information that I'm providing anyway. Right? So if I have, let's just assume that for the purposes of this discussion, we restrict this technology to the 5% of your best customers as a brand, right? So the other 95% we're not talking about at this stage, but the 5% of your best customers, typically that 5% would be found in a loyalty program of some kind.
Yes.
Right? Why would you, as a business, want to store out of date information that imposes a risk on you, a business risk through that storage, right? When every time I interact with you, I'm going to send you much better quality information about me, right? Why would you want that? And that information that I can send you, just to sort of paint a little bit of a picture here, may actually be the very different type of information than you have today. So let's take a hospitality example. I'm sorry that's all sort of hotelish, but you can apply it to airlines or whatever. Let's just say Brendan is a frequent traveler, and every week you go and stay in the same hotel. So you stay in a Hilton hotel somewhere, right? And 1 week of the year, your Hilton was full, and you stayed in a Marriott last year, right? And now you're coming in that time frame. You're coming to the 52nd trip, and you want to stay in the Marriott again because you really liked it. And you go there, and they look at you and say, and you say, well, you know what? I'm a really frequent customer. I'd like a discount. I'd like an upgrade. Look at you, say, what do you mean frequent customer? You only stayed here one night.
Yeah.
How the heck can you be? How can you be a frequent customer? You say, no, I travel a lot, right? They deny you, and they say, yeah, maybe next year, once you've earned your stay.
Yes.
That is a very stupid business. You've just lost opportunity because you've turned away a very valuable customer because that customer is not able to prove to you that they were a frequent traveler, right?
Yeah.
Customer wanted it. Business actually wanted it and would benefit from it, but it was denied because the data was unavailable. So here you have an opportunity to collate all that travel activity behind a single identifier.
Yep.
Right? And forget about the format on which we collate it, but let's just imagine that this information was coming in and it was stored behind my identifier, and it could be used. I don't need to show Marriott the folio receipt for my last stay. What I need to be able to do is prove that I did travel on this date, I did spend this amount of money, and it was with a hotel, right? And he could even say it was with a Hilton hotel.
Yep.
I'm collating that. If I can present that information in a way that is trusted by Marriott, they say, whoa, Brendan is this, he is what he says he is.
Yes.
Right? Sweet upgrade, Brendan.
Yep.
Right? What business wouldn't want to do that? And that's the world that we're talking about. And then if you can do that, why restrict it to just travel and hospitality? Why not? Brendan's just bought a new Tesla. Why not make that information available, right? Hey, Brendan, you've just bought a new Tesla because you shared that information with me. Why don't you come stay at my hotel and I'll give you free Tesla charging or whatever it is, right? That's the world that we're talking to. Or you go to a supermarket every week, take that loyalty information and apply it somewhere else in travel and hospitality, right? So loyalty is where this plays out big time. Big time, right?
And it's never been available. The only people in the past, I mean, your credit card company has a sense of your spending, but then, like most people would probably not just have the single credit card anyway. So they've got a snapshot of your spending.
Mhm.
And if they were clever, they could piece it together. But now everybody that you choose to share that information with understands, as you said, I think that the Marriott example is a good one, because, they would want me as a customer to convert me
Sure.
to a Marriott customer.
Absolutely.
Definitely.
Absolutely. So a little bit of a tiny little segue. We created, or me and a group of people created, the Hospitality and Travel Special Interest Group, which we formed under the Decentralized Identity Foundation,
Okay.
which is a technology standards and early implementation organization creating technology for decentralized digital ID that provides the SSI, basically. And we work in concert with W3C and others. In the SIG, we have written up 6 hospitality and travel use cases that would be really valuable to check out. The URL for DIF is identity.foundation, identity.foundation, and you'll find hospitality and travel special interest group under there. Well worth having a look at, because they give you a view of how things might work. They're purposely aspirational. We didn't say this is what you can do now. We said this is how we think it'll play out over the next 5, 6, 7 years. Bearing in mind that if you, in your mind, go back 7 years, right, in your mind, to the technology that you're carrying. If you picked up a phone that you were carrying 7 years ago, or a laptop that you were carrying 7 years ago, or a browser that you were using 7 years ago, it would look ancient, right? So things change really quickly. So 7 years is actually reasonably short, but it's 3 or 4 major technology cycles. And this technology will play out over that time, but it won't just be organic, right? So it won't be the technology's there, come and use it. It has to get out into people's hands, because this is a model change, right? So internet browsers didn't get out. The Bill Gates epiphany moment of suddenly realizing the internet was a thing was a really important moment, right? That was a big change, and if that hadn't happened, it wouldn't have actually got out to the ordinary, the ordinary person, the non-techie person. So how does it get out?
Is it big business? Is it going to be hospitality chains promoting single source ID?
Well, self-sovereign identity, decentralized digital ID, is quite a different technology stack, right? And it's also quite a different way of thinking about things. Okay, so first of all, you've got to think that you've got to understand it to realize what it offers, that this is better, right? And fortunately, it is so much better that there's a lot of impetus for change. So, there are plenty of governments and influential sectors that are looking at this saying, you know what, it's got to be better. This is the right route forward. Yep. And that's just, why would the commercial sector look at this and say this is the right, we own the customer, we've stored customer information in our databases for years. Well, you have, right? And every year the risk goes up of doing so, right? And it's not just a, this is a real risk. This is the quantifiable, real financial risk. If you lose customer information, you get a big financial slap on the wrist.
Yep.
Right. And to imagine that GDPR or other laws like that are themselves static and finished is fundamentally a misconception, right? Because they track the times as well. So it can't get easier to store customer information. It can't get less expensive, less risky to store customer information if the technology underneath it doesn't do something to help. So this technology does, and therefore governments and influential sectors are looking at it and saying, you know what, this does make an awful lot of sense. Yeah. So I mentioned Connect ID in Australia. It's a group of financial services companies, basically, or financial providers in Australia. They have a set of IDs that they're sort of bringing together. They're connecting those IDs together. So like a lot of countries, they've got startup or initial IDs, initial digital IDs that you can use for a very limited set of things. Yes. What Connect ID is doing is connecting them up. And the rails over which they're connecting them up, not decentralized digital ID, no, don't provide self-sovereignty yet. Standard sort of Web 2, open ID models. But you know what? They're connected, and they allow one ID to represent themselves to another. And they allow, therefore, the ecosystem, the potential of the ecosystem expands exponentially every time you add a new provider in. What Connect ID is going to do is to empower the individual with that wallet, with the credential formats, and I think ultimately to bring in the decentralized identifier as well, because it just makes so much more sense. And if you want to scale it and not to be usable in 100 merchants, to be usable in thousands of merchants, this is the right way to do it. And you know what? Governments are behind it. And obviously governments are relatively cautious, right? They obviously have to be cautious. But they look at things and say, they understand where the direction of travel is, right? So how do I interact with my citizens better? How do they vote, right? How do they pay their taxes? Very important to a government. How do they pay their traffic fines? Very important to a government, right? How do they do sort of citizen Brendan kind of things? Well, increasingly that's online. So wouldn't it make more sense if you could roll all these things together? And we haven't even talked about travel and the sort of passport issuance and driving license and birth certificates and education certificates and all of those kind of things that actually make sense to be digital in a standardized format, to be cumulative behind your identity, and to be usable when you want them to be, right? And for business as well. So here in Europe, another good example, we have this thing called EIDAS, which is European Identity and Authorization Services. And it was a thing that's sort of had some shaky starts, mostly used by businesses, not a huge amount of take up because the ecosystem wasn't there. EIDAS 2, which back in 2020, the European Commission said, for the next version of this, we want interoperability. We want it to be available for all citizens of the EU, all businesses of the EU, all residents of the EU. We want it to be interchangeable, not just within a country, but across borders, across the 27 states here. And when you look at the technologies, actually the technology base that makes sense is exactly what we're talking about here, decentralized digital ID and the standardization of the identifier, the DID, the credentials, the verifiable credentials, and other things that are in standardization right now. And to give you a sense of the direction of travel, in 2021, the Commission said by the end of 23, all states must have the capability to issue one or more, so one or a choice of identities and identifiers and wallets, so physical capabilities to make use of this stuff to citizens, companies, and residents.
Okay.
That's 450 million people, right? And it's not going to be one thing. So each country will have maybe even 2 or 3 of the same things, much like Connect ID. But what they're doing is they're saying, don't go off and do your own things. Don't go off, just it'll be better together. And these are the standards that we have. And just as an example of that, to make the thing that the user, the citizen, the resident actually will interact with, in this case, will be a wallet. To make that wallet functional and interoperable, the European Commission is funding proof of concepts right now, just about to go into a proof of concept project. They've asked for representation from various consortiums with technology that those consortiums have wished to present. The funding is about 50 million euros, 50 million euros, right? That's not a bad chunk of cash. It shows that it's real, right? A very likely consortium. It hasn't. So the tenders are in. It hasn't been announced yet who's won it, but one very likely consortium that could well win this. It's a collection of different states and private companies. Is one that's represented by I think it's called the European Wallet Consortium or EU Wallet Consortium, I think. In their response, which of course is because it's in the EU, it's public, right? They have They have a bunch of horizontal use cases. They're saying, well, we need to expand the technology capabilities in these different ways. And they had one vertical use case. And the vertical use case is travel and hospitality.
Yeah.
Why did they choose it? Because 27 states, everybody has to travel. Everybody understands travel. Everybody experiences travel. And everybody knows that it's broken.
Yeah.
Right? So make it work.
Yeah. Wow.